Sometimes the cruelest words come from those who should love us most. Every woman knows the sting of being told she isn't enough. In 9th century Norway, Jarl Thorgund stood before his kinsmen selling his farmland. When no one stepped forward, he laughed and threw in his daughter as a joke. Brynhildr he called her worthless and too large for marriage. The longhouse filled with uncomfortable laughter. Then a scarred Viking named Eirik Skullcleaver placed 2 silver armrings on the table. He wasn't buying land. He was claiming the woman everyone overlooked. Where others saw shame, this warrior saw strength. Where they saw failure, he recognized endurance. But why would a legendary fighter choose the daughter no one wanted? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning frost clung to the wooden walls of Vestvik's great longhouse like frozen tears, each crystal catching the pale light that struggled through the smoke hole above. Winter had settled deep into the fjord, transforming the landscape into something both beautiful and merciless. The mountains rose like ancient guardians around the settlement, their peaks crowned with snow that would not melt until the spring thaw, if spring came at all this year. Inside the longhouse, the air hung thick with the scent of burning pine and yesterday's mutton stew. Brynhildr moved through the shadows like a ghost, her footsteps muffled by years of practice in making herself invisible. At 23, she had learned that silence was survival, that drawing attention meant drawing her father's scorn. She gathered the wooden bowls from the long tables where Jarl Thorgund's men had broken their fast. Her movements efficient and quiet, her hands, larger than most women's but skilled in their work, stacked the bowls with practiced care. These same hands had woven the wool hangings that kept the winter wind from seeping through the wall cracks, had prepared countless meals for ungrateful mouths, had mended tears in clothing and tears in her own heart with equal patience. Yet when her father looked at her, all he saw was failure. A daughter too broad in shoulder and hip, too quiet in manner, too stubborn in spirit to fetch a bride price worthy of his declining status. In the corner of her small chamber, hidden behind a hanging cloth, stood her weaving loom. The oak frame had belonged to her mother, Astrid the Fair, who had died when Brynhildr was barely 15. The loom was sturdy and well-made, its wood worn smooth by generations of women's hands. Here, in the privacy of darkness, Brynhildr created tapestries of stunning beauty, scenes of ships sailing through storm-tossed seas, of warriors returning home to loving wives, of families gathered around hearth-fires, sharing stories and laughter. None of these tapestries hung in the main hall. Her father had declared them woman's foolishness and ordered them packed away. But Brynhildr continued to weave, driven by something deeper than defiance. In the rhythm of warp and weft, she found a peace that the waking world denied her. Each thread she placed was a choice, a small act of creation in a life that often felt like slow destruction. Jarl Thorgund had not always been cruel. Brynhildr remembered fragments of kindness from her childhood, his calloused hand gentle on her hair as he told stories of the old gods, his proud smile when she mastered a new skill. But those memories felt like dreams now, faded and insubstantial. The man who emerged from his grief after her mother's death was harder, colder, disappointed by everything life had given him. The Jarl's bitterness had deepened with each passing season. His raids brought less silver, his harvests grew thinner, and his once powerful alliances crumbled like old parchment. Younger Jarls rose to prominence while Thorgund's influence waned. In his mind, every misfortune could be traced back to the day the gods had cursed him with a daughter, instead of the strong sons he needed. Brynhildr became the visible reminder of all his failures, a daily reproach to his diminished pride. The longhouse itself reflected this decline. Once its walls had been adorned with fine weapons and rich tapestries, its tables groaning under the weight of abundant feasts. Now the iron hung rusty and neglected. The tapestries had been sold or traded for grain, and meals grew simpler with each passing month. The very timbers seemed to sag under the weight of disappointment and broken dreams. Brynhildr knew every corner of this fading grandeur. She knew which floorboards creaked, which roof beams leaked when the rain fell hard, which servants could be trusted with small confidences and which carried every word back to her father's ears. Gunnar the groomsman was kind but simple, more loyal to his horses than to any human master. Helga the cook had a sharp tongue but a soft heart, slipping extra portions to Brynhildr when the Jarl wasn't watching. Old Bjorn the steward remembered better days, and sometimes looked at Brynhildr with something approaching sympathy. But sympathy was not the same as respect, and respect was what Brynhildr craved most. She had learned to read and write when most women could do neither, taught herself the healing arts from her mother's carefully preserved books, and could manage the household's complex needs with an efficiency that her father took for granted. Yet these accomplishments meant nothing in a world that measured a woman's worth by her beauty and her ability to bear sons. The economic pressures weighing on the household had grown impossible to ignore. Thorgund's latest raid had returned with barely enough silver to pay his men, and the summer's harvest had been poor. Creditors circled like carrion birds, demanding payment for debts that had seemed manageable in better times. The land, rich farmland that had been in Thorgund's family for generations, represented their last substantial asset. Brynhildr understood the mathematics of their situation better than anyone. She had seen the ledgers, counted the dwindling stores, watched her father's face grow graver with each passing day. The land sale was inevitable, but it would also mark the end of everything they had known. Without land, a Jarl was just another aging warrior with nothing to offer but memories of past glory. In her mother's memory box, hidden beneath winter cloaks and forgotten treasures, Brynhildr kept the few remnants of happier times. A silver brooch with intricate knotwork that had belonged to her grandmother. A small wooden horse carved by her father in better days. Letters from her mother's sister in distant Iceland, promising welcome if times grew too hard. These objects were her connection to a world beyond the longhouse walls. Proof that love and kindness existed somewhere beyond her father's reach. Her mother had tried to prepare her for this life, speaking in whispers during the long nights when Thorgund was away raiding. "Strength comes in many forms, my daughter," Astrid had said, her voice already weak with the sickness that would claim her. "The oak bends in the storm but does not break. Remember that when the wind tries to uproot you." Those words had sustained Brynhildr through 8 years of increasing isolation and contempt. The servants moved around her now as she worked, their conversation a low murmur that occasionally rose to include her in practical matters. Which barrels needed checking, when the next supply of firewood would arrive, whether the roof repair could wait until spring. They treated her with the careful respect due to the Jarl's daughter, but she sensed their pity underneath their deference. Everyone knew that Brynhildr would never marry, never have children, never escape the longhouse that had become both her home and her prison. As she worked, Brynhildr allowed herself to imagine different futures. Perhaps her aunt in Iceland would send for her, offering a new start in a land where her past meant nothing. Perhaps some distant relative would remember their kinship and extend an invitation to join their household. Perhaps, and this was the most dangerous thought of all, some man would see past her size and her shyness to the woman beneath, valuing her mind and heart over her appearance. But these dreams always crumbled when she caught sight of herself in the polished metal that served as a mirror. Her face was pleasant enough, with clear skin and intelligent brown eyes, but her body was undeniably large, not soft with pampered excess, but broad and strong from years of hard work. In a culture that prized delicate beauty in women, she was an anomaly, too substantial for conventional attractiveness. Too proud for conventional submission. The morning wore on, and Brynhildr completed her rounds of the longhouse. The great hall needed fresh rushes on the floor. The storage rooms required inventory before the next market day, and someone needed to check on the salted meat hanging in the smokehouse. These tasks filled her hours, but not her heart, keeping her hands busy while her mind wandered to distant shores and impossible possibilities. Outside, she could hear the sounds of preparation. Word had already spread through Vestvik that Jarl Thorgund would offer his farmland for sale. Potential buyers would come, men with silver and ambition, seeking to add to their holdings or establish themselves in new territory. They would examine the soil, assess the buildings, calculate profit margins and strategic advantages. None of them would notice the Jarl's daughter except as an unfortunate burden that came with the property, or so everyone believed. But fate, as Brynhildr's mother had often said, delights in surprising those who think they understand its patterns. The day of the land sale dawned grey and bitter, with clouds hanging low over the fjord like funeral shrouds. Ice crystals danced in the air, stinging the faces of the men who gathered in Thorgund's longhouse. They came from settlements up and down the coast, some seeking opportunity, others drawn by curiosity about the once mighty Jarl's fall from grace. Brynhildr moved among them like a shadow, serving ale and ensuring the fire burned bright. She recognized most of the faces: neighboring Jarls, wealthy merchants, younger sons seeking to establish their own holdings. Their voices filled the hall with talk of soil quality, timber rights, and access to fishing grounds. To them, this was business. To her, it was the dissolution of everything she had ever known. Her father sat in his carved chair at the head of the hall, still maintaining the dignity of his position, despite the circumstances that had brought them here. The years had carved deep lines around his eyes and silvered his once golden beard, but Jarl Thorgund still commanded respect through sheer force of will. The land deed lay before him on the table, ancient parchment bearing his seal, representing not just property, but generations of family history. The farmland stretches from the stream to the stone marker, Thorgund announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. 40 acres of good soil, timber rights to the north slope, and grazing for 30 head of cattle. The buildings are sound, the wells run clear, and the location offers protection from the worst storms. The assembled men nodded, some making notes on wax tablets, others whispering among themselves about the asking price. Brynhildr knew her father had set the sum high enough to clear his debts and maintain some dignity, but perhaps too high for reality. She watched the faces around the table, seeing calculation rather than genuine interest. Hours passed. The ale flowed freely, loosening tongues and warming the chill air, but no firm offers emerged. Men examined the deed, asked pointed questions about boundaries and obligations, then settled back in their seats with non-committal murmurs. The price was indeed too steep for most, and those who could afford it questioned whether the land was worth the investment. Thorgund's jaw tightened with each passing hour. Brynhildr could see the desperation building behind his carefully maintained composure. Without this sale, they would face complete ruin within months. The creditors would not wait much longer, and winter made borrowing from neighbors nearly impossible. Everything hinged on finding a buyer today. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Thorgund's desperation transformed into something darker, the cruel humor that emerged when his pride was wounded. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and raised his drinking horn high. "It seems my land is not to everyone's taste," he said, his voice carrying an edge of bitter laughter. "Perhaps the price is too dear for such cautious men. Very well, let me sweeten the offer." Brynhildr felt ice form in her stomach. She knew that tone, had heard it before when her father's anger sought a target. The men in the hall leaned forward, sensing entertainment in the Jarl's words. "Whoever buys this land," Thorgund continued, his voice growing louder, "gets my obese daughter for free." He gestured toward Brynhildr with a sweeping motion that made her feel exposed and small. Look at her, too large for any decent man, too stubborn for proper submission, but she comes with the property. Think of it as livestock included in the purchase. The longhouse erupted in uncomfortable laughter. The men guffawed loudly, caught up in the cruel jest, while others shifted uneasily in their seats. Brynhildr stood frozen, the serving pitcher trembling in her hands. The humiliation crashed over her like an icy wave, stealing her breath and burning her cheeks with shame. She eats too much, speaks too little, and has the grace of a pregnant cow," Thorgund went on, warming to his theme as the laughter encouraged him. "But she's strong enough for farm work and might breed true if you can find her in the dark." Each word was a blade, cutting away another piece of Brynhildr's dignity. She wanted to flee, to disappear into the shadows and never emerge, but her feet seemed rooted to the floor. The laughter around her felt like thunder, drowning out the voice in her head that screamed this was wrong, that she was worth more than this cruelty. Then abruptly, the laughter died. A new presence had entered the longhouse, a man who moved with the deadly grace of a predator, his very stillness commanding attention. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a simple brown cloak that failed to hide the warrior's build beneath. Scars marked his hands and face, telling stories of battles fought and survived. His eyes, pale blue like winter ice, swept the hall before settling on the land deed. "Eirik Skullcleaver," someone whispered, and the name rippled through the assembly like wind through grain. Even Brynhildr knew the legend, a warrior so ruthless that his enemies spoke his name in hushed tones, a man who had carved his reputation from the bones of those who stood against him. Eirik approached the table with measured steps, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed him. From beneath his cloak, he produced 2 silver armrings, heavy, gleaming bands that caught the firelight like captured stars. He placed them on the table before Thorgund with deliberate care, the metal ringing against the wood. "I'll take the land," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the suddenly silent hall. "And the woman?" The words hit Brynhildr like a physical blow. This legendary warrior, this man whose very name inspired fear, was claiming her as part of a property transaction. She expected to feel deeper humiliation, but instead found herself studying his face. There was no cruelty in his expression, no mockery in his pale eyes. He looked at her directly, meeting her gaze with something that might have been respect. Thorgund blinked rapidly, clearly not having expected anyone to take his jest seriously. You want to buy the land?" "I do," Eirik replied simply. He gestured to the silver armrings. "Payment in full, as requested." The value of the silver far exceeded Thorgund's asking price, and everyone in the hall knew it. This was not just a purchase, it was a statement, though what kind of statement remained unclear. Thorgund looked from the silver to his daughter, to the scarred warrior who had just upended his cruel entertainment. "She's not much to look at," Thorgund said weakly, perhaps hoping to discourage the buyer or at least maintain his role in the jest. "I have eyes," Eirik said calmly. "The transaction is acceptable to me." Brynhildr found herself unable to look away from this strange man who had just changed her life with a few words and 2 pieces of silver. She had expected her father's cruelty, had braced herself for the laughter and mockery of the assembled men. But she had not expected this, to be claimed by a legend, to be valued by someone who could have had his pick of any property, any woman. The formal completion of the sale passed in a blur. Hands were clasped, witnesses summoned, and the deed transferred to its new owner. Through it all, Eirik remained calm and businesslike, treating the transaction as he might any other. He spoke briefly with Thorgund about practical matters, when possession would transfer, which animals and tools were included, what debts travelled with the property. Only when the formalities were complete did he turn to Brynhildr. "Gather what you wish to bring," he said quietly. "We leave within the hour." The simple courtesy in his words, the assumption that she might have possessions worth keeping, belongings worth treasuring, brought tears to her eyes. In all her father's cruel jest, in all the laughter that had surrounded her humiliation, no one had considered that she might be more than property to be transferred. As she moved through the longhouse, gathering her few precious things, Brynhildr felt the weight of every watching eye. The men who had laughed at her father's cruelty now watched with something approaching awe as the legendary Skullcleaver prepared to leave with his unexpected acquisition. None of them understood why he had chosen her, but none dared question a man of his reputation. Her mother's silver brooch went into her small travel pack, along with the wooden horse her father had carved long ago. She rolled her warmest cloak tightly and tucked her mother's letters into the inner pocket. The weaving loom would have to stay, too large and fragile for travel, but she traced her fingers along its familiar frame one last time, whispering a silent goodbye to the dreams she had woven there. When she emerged from her chamber, Eirik was waiting by the door. He had saddled 2 horses, a sturdy mare for her and a large gelding for himself. Without ceremony or further words, he helped her mount, his touch careful and respectful. Then he swung onto his own horse and turned toward the door. As they rode away from the only home she had ever known, Brynhildr looked back once at the longhouse, where her father still sat, surrounded by his silver and his guests. He did not come to the door to watch her leave, did not offer any word of farewell or blessing. The transaction was complete, and she was no longer his concern. The path ahead led into unknown territory, following a man whose reputation was built on violence, but whose actions spoke of something else entirely. Brynhildr gripped her horse's reins and faced forward, leaving her past behind, with each step of the horse's hooves on the frozen ground. The journey to Eriksfjordstead stretched through a landscape that grew more isolated with each mile. They rode in silence for the first hour, the only sounds the steady rhythm of hoofbeats on frozen ground and the whisper of wind through bare branches. Brynhildr found herself stealing glances at her unexpected savior, or captor. She wasn't entirely sure which he was. Eirik sat his horse with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to long journeys and uncertain terrain. His battle-worn cloak, thick wool marked with old repairs and faded stains that might once have been blood, hung around his shoulders like a second skin. The garment told stories of campaigns and conflicts, yet now it served as protection for a man seeking peace rather than war. "Are you cold?" he asked suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled between them. The simple question caught Brynhildr off guard. No one had asked after her comfort in longer than she could remember. "No," she replied, then added more honestly, "Not too cold." He nodded and guided his horse closer to hers. Without ceremony, he unwrapped a second cloak from his saddle-pack and handed it to her. "The wind will grow sharper as we climb. Better to be warm than sorry." The wool was fine quality, soft against her skin and carrying the faint scent of pine smoke and something else, something distinctly masculine that made her think of strength and safety. She wrapped it gratefully around her shoulders, surprised by both the gesture and the care behind it. "Where are we going?" she asked, emboldened by his kindness. "My holding lies 2 valleys over," Eirik replied. "It's isolated, but that has its advantages. The land is good, the water runs clean, and visitors are rare enough to be noteworthy." The implication hung between them, that isolation meant privacy, safety from the kind of public humiliation she had just endured. Brynhildr found herself both grateful for the prospect and nervous about what such isolation might mean for her situation with this legendary warrior. As they rode deeper into the mountains, the landscape transformed around them. The path wound through stands of ancient pine and over streams that chuckled beneath thin ice. Snow clung to the north-facing slopes, but the southern exposures showed patches of brown earth where the winter sun could reach. It was beautiful in a stark, unforgiving way, a land that demanded respect and offered its gifts only to those strong enough to claim them. "It's beautiful," Brynhildr said softly. Not entirely sure she had meant to speak aloud, Eirik followed her gaze to where the mountains rose like cathedral spires against the grey sky. "I thought so too when I first saw it. That was 3 years ago, when I decided to stop wandering and find a place to call home. 3 years since he had retired from whatever violent life had earned him his fearsome reputation." Brynhildr wondered what had driven him to seek peace, what battles had finally convinced the legendary Skullcleaver to lay down his weapons. But she lacked the courage to ask such personal questions of a man she barely knew. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when they finally crested a ridge and looked down into a narrow valley. Below them, nestled against the curve of a small fjord, lay Eirik's home. It was larger than she had expected, a well-built hall with several outbuildings, all constructed from sturdy timber and showing the care of a man who took pride in his possessions. The sight filled Brynhildr with an unexpected mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that her new home appeared comfortable and well-maintained. Apprehension about what role she would play in this unfamiliar place. Was she to be a servant, a concubine, or something else entirely? Eirik had given no indication of his expectations, and she found his silence both reassuring and unnerving. As they descended into the valley, smoke rose from the hall's central chimney, and Brynhildr could see light gleaming warmly through the windows. Someone had prepared for their arrival, and she wondered who else lived in this isolated place. Her question was answered when they reached the main building. An elderly woman emerged from the hall, wiping her hands on a stained apron and studying Brynhildr with sharp, intelligent eyes. She was small and wiry, with silver hair braided simply and skin weathered by years of hard work. But she carried herself with the dignity of someone accustomed to authority. "Astrid," Eirik said, dismounting and gesturing toward Brynhildr. "This is Brynhildr. She'll be staying with us." The old woman, Astrid, stepped forward and helped Brynhildr down from her horse with surprising strength. Her touch was gentle but firm, and her eyes held a warmth that reminded Brynhildr painfully of her own mother. "Welcome, child," Astrid said simply. "You look half frozen. Come inside and warm yourself by the fire." The interior of Eirik's hall was a revelation. Unlike her father's longhouse, with its faded grandeur and accumulated grime, this space was clean, well-organized, and comfortable. The walls were lined with simple but well-made furniture. The floors were clean-swept, and everything showed the care of people who took pride in their surroundings. A large hearth dominated one wall, its fire casting dancing shadows that made the room feel alive and welcoming. "Sit," Astrid commanded, guiding Brynhildr to a chair near the fire. "I'll bring you something warm to drink." As the old woman bustled away, Eirik removed his cloak and hung it on a wooden peg near the door. Beneath the travel garments, he wore a simple tunic and trousers that emphasized his powerful build without ostentation. The scars Brynhildr had noticed on his hands and face were more visible now, telling stories of violence that seemed at odds with the peaceful domesticity of his home. "Astrid manages the household," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "She came with the property when I bought it and chose to stay. Her wisdom has been invaluable." The way he spoke of the old woman, with respect and genuine affection, told Brynhildr something important about Eirik's character. A man who valued the counsel of elderly servants was not likely to be cruel to an unwanted wife. Astrid returned with a steaming cup of mulled wine that warmed Brynhildr from the inside out. The drink was spiced with cinnamon and honey, luxuries that spoke of prosperity and care. As she sipped gratefully, she became aware that both Eirik and Astrid were watching her with something approaching concern. "You've had a difficult day," Eirik said quietly. "Your father's words were cruel and unnecessary." The acknowledgement of her humiliation brought tears to Brynhildr's eyes. She had expected her new situation to be built on pretending that scene had never happened, that she had not been offered like livestock and claimed like property. Instead, Eirik spoke of it directly, with a gentleness that made her feel human again. "He was not always so," she said, feeling the need to defend the man who had raised her, despite everything. "Grief changed him. Grief changes us all," Eirik replied. "But it does not excuse cruelty to those who deserve our protection." The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence as Brynhildr finished her wine and felt warmth returning to her hands and feet. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the shutters, and reminding her how isolated this place truly was. But inside the circle of firelight, with Astrid moving quietly about her evening tasks and Eirik maintaining his thoughtful silence, she felt something she had not experienced in years: safety. "I've prepared a chamber for you," Astrid said eventually. "It's small but private, and the bed is comfortable. Tomorrow we can discuss how you'd like to arrange things." The assumption that she would have choices in her living arrangements was another small kindness that touched Brynhildr deeply. She rose from her chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was from the day's emotional upheavals. "Thank you," she said to both of them. "For everything," Eirik nodded solemnly. "This is your home now, Brynhildr. Whatever else may come, you are safe here." As Astrid led her to a small but well-appointed chamber, Brynhildr found herself believing those words. The legendary Skullcleaver had claimed her with silver and brought her to a place where kindness seemed possible. Whatever the future held, it had to be better than what she had left behind. The first week at Eirik's fjordstead passed like a cautious dance between strangers, learning each other's rhythms. Brynhildr woke each morning to the sound of waves lapping against the rocky shore and the distant cry of gulls wheeling overhead. The chamber Astrid had prepared for her was indeed small but comfortable, with a window that looked out over the fjord and caught the morning light when the sun managed to pierce the winter clouds. She fell naturally into the household routines, her years of managing her father's longhouse serving her well in this new environment. But here, her efforts were noticed and appreciated. When she reorganized the food stores for better preservation, Astrid nodded approvingly. When she mended a tear in one of Eirik's tunics with nearly invisible stitches, he thanked her with genuine gratitude. These small acknowledgments meant more to her than grand gestures ever could. Eirik himself remained something of a mystery. During the day, he worked with quiet efficiency, checking the livestock, mending fences, splitting wood for the fires. He moved with the same deadly grace she had observed in the longhouse, but here it was, channeled into domestic tasks that spoke of a man seeking to build rather than destroy. She often found herself watching him work, fascinated by the contrast between his fearsome reputation and his gentle treatment of the animals under his care. But it was during the nights that Brynhildr began to understand the cost of Eirik's violent past. Through the thin walls of her chamber, she could hear him moving restlessly in the main hall where he slept. Sometimes he would cry out in his sleep, words she couldn't quite make out, but which carried the weight of old terror and regret. On the worst nights, she would hear him rise and pace the floor until dawn, wrestling with demons that daylight couldn't banish. She never mentioned these nocturnal disturbances, sensing that acknowledging them would embarrass him. Instead, she began leaving a cup of chamomile tea near the fire each evening, along with a small bowl that contained a mixture of herbs her mother had taught her would ease troubled sleep. Eirik never commented on these offerings, but they were always gone by morning. It was Astrid who finally explained the depth of Eirik's transformation. They were working together in the kitchen, preparing the evening meal, when the old woman began to share what she knew of their host's history. "He came here 3 years ago," Astrid said, her hands busy with kneading bread. "Bought the land from a merchant who'd inherited it but never visited. The previous owner left everything, furniture, livestock, even me." She smiled at this last part. "I was too old to start over somewhere new, and Eirik needed someone who knew the local ways." Brynhildr continued stirring the stew while listening intently. Information about Eirik felt precious, each detail helping her understand the complex man who had claimed her. "He was different then," Astrid continued. "Harder. You could see the violence in him just beneath the surface, but also the exhaustion. Whatever battles he'd fought, whatever deeds had earned him that name, they'd worn him down to the bone." The old woman paused in her kneading, her eyes distant with memory. "The first winter was difficult. He'd wake screaming most nights, and during the day he'd work himself to collapse trying to outrun whatever haunted him. I thought he might not survive it, not the cold or the isolation, but the war inside his own head. What changed?" Brynhildr asked softly. "Time," Astrid replied simply, "and the decision to choose peace over pride. It's not easy for a man who's made his living with sword and shield to find worth in simpler things. But gradually he learned to see beauty in a well-built fence, satisfaction in a successful harvest, peace in the silence of snow falling." That evening, as they shared their meal around the wooden table Eirik had carved himself, Brynhildr found herself studying the simple bowl from which he ate. It was made of light oak, shaped with obvious care, and decorated with subtle patterns carved into the rim. The craftsmanship was beautiful, speaking of patience and attention to detail that seemed at odds with his warrior's reputation. "Did you make this?" she asked, running her finger along the carved design. Eirik nodded, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. "It was practice. Learning to create instead of destroy takes time." The bowl represented something profound, a man's deliberate choice to channel his skills toward beauty rather than violence, to find meaning in small acts of creation. Brynhildr understood the significance of that choice, having made similar decisions in her own life when faced with bitterness and despair. "It's beautiful," she said, and meant it. "The pattern reminds me of water flowing over stones." His eyes met hers across the table, and for a moment she saw something vulnerable in their pale depths. "That's what I hope to capture. The stream that runs behind the house. I watch it sometimes when sleep won't come." The admission hung between them, an acknowledgement of his nighttime struggles without making them the center of attention. Brynhildr felt honored by the small confidence, the first real glimpse into the man behind the legend. As the days grew shorter and the cold deepened, word began to reach them from the outside world. Traders traveling the coastal routes brought news of increasing unrest in the region. Raiding parties had been spotted moving south, their intentions unclear, but their presence troubling to the scattered settlements that dotted the fjords. The news clearly disturbed Eirik, though he tried to hide his concern. Brynhildr watched him grow more watchful, more alert to sounds that might indicate approaching strangers. He began spending time each morning checking the approaches to their valley, and she noticed that he had moved his weapons closer to hand, though he still made no move to wear them. "Are we in danger?" she asked one evening as they sat by the fire. Eirik was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words carefully. "Perhaps. These mountains have always attracted men seeking to avoid attention, some harmless, others less so. It's one of the reasons I chose this place, but it can be a disadvantage as well as protection." The possibility of threat made Brynhildr aware of how dependent she had become on this isolated sanctuary. In the space of barely 2 weeks, Eirik's fjordstead had begun to feel like home in ways her father's longhouse never had. The thought of losing this peace, of being forced back into a world of cruelty and contempt, filled her with a fear that surprised her with its intensity. But alongside the fear came something new, a fierce protectiveness for what they had built here. This place, these people, this fragile domestic happiness was worth defending. For the first time in her life, Brynhildr had something precious to lose, and the realization both terrified and strengthened her. "If trouble comes," she said quietly, "I won't be a burden. I can help." Eirik looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I believe you could," he said finally, "but I hope it won't come to that." Outside, the wind howled through the mountain passes, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of harder days ahead. But inside their circle of firelight, surrounded by the simple comforts they had created together, Brynhildr felt a peace she had never known. Whatever storms might come, they would face them from a position of strength, not the strength of weapons or warriors, but the deeper strength that came from knowing they were no longer alone. Winter deepened around the fjordstead like a slow embrace, bringing with it longer nights and a crystalline beauty that transformed the familiar landscape into something magical. Snow fell steadily for 3 days, blanketing the valley in pristine white that sparkled under the pale sun. Brynhildr found herself drawn to the windows during her work, marveling at how the harsh world beyond their walls could look so peaceful. It was during these quiet weeks that she began to discover her own capabilities, freed from the constant criticism that had shaped her sense of self. Without her father's voice telling her she was clumsy, worthless, too large for grace, Brynhildr found herself moving with new confidence. Her hands, no longer trembling with anticipated disapproval, proved remarkably skilled at tasks that required precision and care. She reorganized the household stores with an efficiency that impressed even practical Astrid. The root cellar, previously a jumbled collection of sacks and barrels, became a model of organization that would ensure they could find what they needed even in the depths of winter. She calculated food requirements with mathematical precision, stretching their supplies while ensuring adequate nutrition for the household through the lean months ahead. More importantly, she began to show the intelligence that her father had dismissed as unwomanly stubbornness. During the long evenings, she and Eirik fell into conversations that ranged from practical matters of farm management to more complex discussions of trade routes, seasonal weather patterns, and the political tensions affecting their region. Eirik listened to her observations with genuine interest, treating her insights as valuable rather than presumptuous. "You have a mind for strategy," he told her one evening after she had suggested improvements to their livestock management that would reduce winter feed requirements while maintaining the animals' health. "Your father was a fool not to recognize it." The compliment warmed her more than the fire crackling in the hearth. For so long, she had been told that thinking was not her place, that her opinions were unwelcome and her ideas worthless. To have them valued by a man whose judgment she had come to respect felt like discovering a hidden part of herself. During one of her quiet moments, while organizing her few possessions, Brynhildr discovered her mother's silver brooch nestled in the bottom of her travel pack. The intricate knotwork seemed to glow in the firelight, and as she traced the familiar patterns with her finger, memories flooded back of her mother wearing it on special occasions. The brooch had been passed down through generations of women in her family, each adding their own stories to its legacy. Holding it now, Brynhildr felt a connection to something larger than her current circumstances. Her mother had been strong in ways that went beyond physical endurance. She had possessed a quiet dignity that no amount of hardship could touch, a grace that came from knowing her own worth, regardless of what others might say. The brooch represented that strength, that unshakable sense of self that Brynhildr was only now beginning to understand. She began wearing the brooch on her daily dress, and though neither Eirik nor Astrid commented on the addition, she noticed their approving glances. The silver caught the light as she moved, a small but visible symbol of her growing sense of her own value. It was during these peaceful weeks that Eirik began to share more of his own story. The revelations came gradually, during quiet moments when the evening's work was done and they sat by the fire with cups of ale. She learned that his reputation as Skullcleaver had been earned in the service of various jarls. Hired as a weapon when diplomacy failed and overwhelming force became necessary. "I was good at it," he said one night, his voice carrying the weight of old regret. "Perhaps too good. When you become known for solving problems with violence, violence becomes the only tool people offer you." He spoke of battles that had no clear victors, of causes that seemed righteous until viewed from the perspective of years and distance. The silver he had paid for her and the land had been earned in blood, payment for services that had left scars on his soul as well as his body. "The last campaign was different," he continued, staring into the fire as if seeing ghosts in the flames. A dispute over inheritance rights that turned into a massacre. When it was over, I looked at what we had accomplished and saw only waste. Good men dead for the pride of jarls who would forget their names before the bodies were cold. That had been his moment of transformation, the point where the warrior chose to become something else. He had taken his payment and walked away from everything that had defined him, seeking a place where he could discover who Eirik might be when he wasn't wielding death as a tool. "Some men are meant for war," he said quietly. "But I learned that being good at something doesn't mean you're meant for it. The peace I've found here is worth more than all the silver I ever earned with my sword." These conversations deepened the bond growing between them, built on mutual understanding of what it meant to be defined by others' expectations rather than one's own choices. Brynhildr began to see that they were both refugees in their own way, she from a father's cruelty, he from a life that had demanded he surrender his humanity in exchange for reputation and gold. But their growing closeness was shadowed by increasing reports of unrest in the outside world. Traders brought word that the raiding parties had grown bolder, striking at isolated farmsteads and disappearing back into the mountains before organized resistance could be mounted. The attacks seemed random, but their frequency was increasing, and the raiders showed a knowledge of local conditions that suggested inside information. Eirik's reaction to these reports troubled Brynhildr. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his desire for peace and the warrior's instinct to prepare for battle. He began spending more time checking their defenses, noting potential weak points in their position, and considering how best to protect what they had built. "They're getting closer," he said one morning, returning from his daily reconnaissance with a grim expression. "Smoke on the horizon from the Eriksson farmstead. That's less than a day's ride from here." The news sent a chill through the household that had nothing to do with the winter cold. The Erikssons were known to be prosperous and well defended, not the kind of easy target that raiders typically chose. If they had been attacked, it suggested a level of organization and boldness that threatened every settlement in the region. "What do we do?" Brynhildr asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. Eirik's jaw tightened, and for a moment she saw a flash of the legendary warrior who had earned his fearsome reputation. "We prepare," he said simply, "and we hope that preparation proves unnecessary." But even as he spoke the words, they all knew that hope was becoming a fragile thing, as delicate as the ice that formed in the morning on their windows, beautiful but easily shattered by the right pressure applied at the right moment. The delegation arrived on a morning when frost painted intricate patterns on every surface, their horses' breath creating clouds in the bitter air. Brynhildr watched from the hall's main window as 5 riders approached the fjordstead, their purposeful bearing and rich clothing marking them as men of importance. Eirik emerged from the stable where he had been tending to a lame horse, his posture shifting subtly as he recognized the nature of their visitors. The leader was Jarl Magnus Ironside, a man whose reputation for both wisdom and ruthlessness had earned him respect throughout the region. Behind him rode 4 companions, younger jarls and wealthy landowners whose holdings had likely felt the raiders' touch or feared its coming. Their faces were grim, carved with the weight of hard decisions and harder times. "Eirik Skullcleaver," Magnus called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the authority of long command. "We need to speak." The formal nature of the address sent a chill through Brynhildr that had nothing to do with the morning cold. These men hadn't come for social conversation or casual news. They had come to call upon the warrior Eirik had tried to leave behind. Inside the hall, the delegation arranged themselves around the central table with the practiced ease of men accustomed to war councils. Astrid served them ale without being asked, her weathered face revealing nothing of her thoughts, but Brynhildr could see the tension in the old woman's movements. This kind of gathering rarely brought good news. "The situation has grown beyond what any of us can handle alone," Magnus began without preamble. "These raiders aren't common thieves looking for easy silver. They're organized, well-equipped, and they know our weaknesses too well for comfort." He spread a rough map on the table, marking locations with small stones as he spoke. 7 farmsteads hit in the last month, 3 fishing villages burned, 2 merchant caravans vanished completely on roads that should have been safe. They strike fast, take what they want, and disappear before we can mount any response. Eirik studied the map with the eye of a man who had spent years thinking tactically about such problems. Brynhildr could see him analyzing patterns, calculating distances, identifying the strategic thinking behind what might appear to be random violence. "What do you want from me?" Eirik asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Your help," said another of the jarls, a younger man whose beard was singed on one side, evidence of recent proximity to fire. "You know warfare like no one else in this region. We need your knowledge, your experience, and your sword," Magnus added bluntly. "These aren't farmers with pitchforks we're facing. Whoever leads them knows what they're doing, and they've got fighters who can match our best men blade for blade." The request hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, acrid and impossible to ignore. Brynhildr felt her heart clench as she watched Eirik wrestle with the decision she knew was tearing him apart. Everything they had built here, the peace, the quiet domestic happiness, the careful transformation from warrior to craftsman, all of it balanced on the edge of this moment. "I left that life behind," Eirik said quietly. "For good reasons." "We know," Magnus replied with surprising gentleness, "and we wouldn't ask if there were any other choice. But good men are dying, Eirik. Children are losing fathers. Wives are becoming widows, and we're no closer to stopping it than we were a month ago." The appeal to his conscience was expertly delivered, and Brynhildr could see its effect on Eirik's carefully maintained composure. This was a man who had spent 3 years learning to value creation over destruction, peace over glory. Yet his past skills remained the key to protecting everything he now held dear. It was then that Brynhildr made a decision that surprised even herself. She stepped forward from where she had been standing quietly near the kitchen, her mother's silver brooch catching the firelight as she moved. "What makes you think Eirik should risk his life for communities that have never offered him anything but his reputation?" she asked, her voice steady despite the boldness of her intervention. The Jarls turned to look at her, with expressions ranging from surprise to outright dismissal. Magnus raised an eyebrow, clearly unaccustomed to being questioned by women in such gatherings. "This is not a matter for—" the younger Jarl began. But Eirik cut him off with a raised hand. "She has the right to speak," Eirik said firmly. "This decision affects her as much as me." Brynhildr felt a surge of gratitude for his support, but she pressed on with her point. "You ask him to return to a life that nearly destroyed him, to risk everything he's built here. But what do you offer in return? What guarantee that his sacrifice will mean anything beyond temporary safety?" Magnus studied her with new interest, recognizing intelligence behind the challenge. "What would you suggest?" "Alliance," Brynhildr replied without hesitation. "Not just Eirik's help in this crisis, but a true partnership afterward. Recognition that the man who helps you deserves more than gratitude. He deserves belonging." The suggestion clearly hadn't occurred to the delegation, accustomed as they were to thinking in terms of temporary alliances and expedient solutions. But Brynhildr could see the wheels turning in Magnus's mind as he considered the implications. "You're asking us to accept a former mercenary as an equal," he said slowly. "I'm asking you to accept a man who has proven his worth in every way that matters," Brynhildr replied. "If you want his help now, you should want his counsel in peacetime as well." The negotiation that followed was unlike anything Brynhildr had ever witnessed. These hardened leaders, men who commanded hundreds of followers and controlled vast holdings, found themselves arguing terms with a woman they had initially dismissed as irrelevant. But her logic was unassailable, and her fierce defense of Eirik's interests impressed even those who disagreed with her conclusions. In the end, they reached an agreement that satisfied everyone, though perhaps not completely. Eirik would provide strategic guidance and participate in the military response to the raiders. In return, the other Jarls would formally recognize his status as an equal, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. His counsel would be sought in regional matters. His holding would be protected as part of their mutual defense pact, and his chosen wife would be accepted without question or mockery. As the delegation prepared to leave, Magnus approached Brynhildr privately. "That was well done," he said quietly. "Eirik is fortunate to have someone who sees his worth so clearly." "He saw mine first," she replied simply. After the visitors had departed, Eirik stood for a long time, looking out over the fjord, where ice was beginning to form along the shore. Brynhildr joined him, understanding that he was saying goodbye to the simple peace they had shared. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know this isn't what you wanted." "No," he agreed. "But you were right. Some things are worth fighting for, and some fights choose us, whether we want them or not." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Thank you for understanding what I needed, even when I couldn't see it myself." That night, as they sat by the fire that had witnessed so many quiet conversations, Eirik retrieved something from a wooden chest in the corner. It was his sword, wrapped in oiled cloth and put away with the hope that it would never be needed again. The weapon was magnificent in its deadly simplicity, its blade marked with the scars of countless battles, its grip worn smooth by familiar hands. "I had hoped never to touch this again," he said softly, testing the weapon's balance with movements that spoke of muscle memory too deep to forget. "Maybe this will be the last time," Brynhildr offered, though they both knew how hollow such hopes could be. "Maybe," Eirik agreed. "But whether it is or isn't, I'm grateful I won't face it alone." The sword rested between them like a bridge between past and future, a reminder that some battles were unavoidable, but that how one faced them could still be a choice. Together, they would meet whatever came with the strength they had built in each other. And perhaps that would be enough. The attack came 3 days after the delegation's visit, swift and merciless as a winter storm. Brynhildr woke to the sound of hoofbeats thundering past their valley, followed by an orange glow on the horizon that could only mean fire. The Bjornsson farm, their nearest neighbor, was burning. Eirik was already moving, pulling on boots and reaching for the sword he had hoped never to wield again. "Stay inside," he commanded, but his tone was distracted, his mind already shifting into the tactical patterns that had kept him alive through countless battles. "I'm coming with you," Brynhildr said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Absolutely not. These aren't farmers with grievances, they're killers who take pleasure in their work." But even as he spoke, they both knew the argument was academic. Whether she accompanied him or stayed behind, danger had found their peaceful valley. The raiders were no longer a distant threat, but an immediate reality, and nowhere would be truly safe until they were stopped. The ride to the Bjornsson farm took only minutes, but it felt like hours. The acrid smell of burning wood and thatch filled the air, along with something else, something that made Eirik's face go pale and hard. When they crested the small hill that overlooked the farmstead, Brynhildr understood why. The farm wasn't just burned, it was destroyed with a thoroughness that spoke of hatred rather than simple greed. Buildings had been deliberately collapsed, livestock slaughtered and left to rot, wells poisoned with debris. This wasn't the work of raiders seeking profit. It was the work of someone sending a message. "They wanted us to see this," Eirik said grimly, dismounting to examine the devastation more closely. "This isn't random violence, it's a warning." As they moved through the ruins, searching for any sign of survivors, Brynhildr noticed something that chilled her blood. Burned fragments of cloth clung to a fence post, scraps of fabric that had once been a banner. But not just any banner, the pattern was familiar. The colors one she had seen flying proudly over her father's longhouse. "Eirik," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. He followed her gaze to the torn banner, and his expression darkened with understanding. The implications hit them both simultaneously, like a physical blow that left them reeling. This wasn't the work of unknown raiders striking at random targets. "This was personal. Your father," Eirik said, the words heavy with disbelief and growing rage. Brynhildr nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. The evidence was unmistakable. Jarl Thorgund had allied himself with the raiders, providing them with information about local defenses, wealth, and weaknesses. He had sold out his own people for reasons that made no sense to her shocked mind. As they searched further, they found more evidence of her father's involvement. Tracks leading away from the farm followed paths that only locals would know, routes that avoided the main roads and settlements where organized resistance might be mounted. Someone with intimate knowledge of the region had planned these attacks. Someone who knew exactly where to strike for maximum impact with minimum risk. The full horror of the betrayal began to sink in as they rode back toward their own holding. Her father hadn't just abandoned her, he had actively put her in danger, along with everyone else in the region. The man who should have protected his people had instead become their enemy, trading their safety for whatever the raiders had offered him. Why? Brynhildr asked, though she knew Eirik couldn't answer that question. What could they have given him that was worth this? "Pride," Eirik replied bitterly. "Your father's pride was wounded when I claimed you. Maybe he sees this as revenge. If he can't have respect, he'll settle for fear. The psychological brutality of it staggered her. Bad enough that Thorgund had offered her as a joke, had treated her as property to be discarded. But to then ally with raiders who threatened her new life, her new happiness, that level of cruelty seemed beyond even his capacity for spite. When they reached the fjordstead, Astrid took one look at their faces and began preparing for siege without being told. The old woman had lived through enough conflicts to recognize the signs, and her movements were efficient and purposeful as she gathered supplies and checked their defenses. "How long do we have?" she asked quietly. "Not long," Eirik replied. "They know where we are, they know our resources, and they know exactly how isolated we are. If your father has told them everything, they'll know this is a target worth hitting." The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound. Brynhildr had thought herself beyond her father's power to hurt her, had believed that his worst cruelties were already in the past. But this was a violation that reached across the miles to poison even the sanctuary she had found. As evening fell, they made their preparations with grim efficiency. Weapons were checked and positioned, escape routes planned, signals arranged with the few neighbors who might be able to provide help. But through it all, Brynhildr found herself struggling with emotions she couldn't quite name. Alongside the fear and anger was something unexpected, a fierce protectiveness for what they had built here. The thought of raiders destroying their careful peace, of her father's spite reaching out to tear down the first happiness she had ever known, filled her with a rage that surprised her with its intensity. "I won't let them take this," she said as they completed their preparations. "I won't let him destroy what we've made." Eirik looked at her with something that might have been pride. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that I'm not the same woman who left that longhouse. I'm not his property to dispose of or his toy to break when he's angry. This is my home now, and I'll fight for it." The declaration seemed to crystallize something in both of them. This wasn't just about survival, it was about refusing to be victims, about claiming the right to determine their own fate, rather than having it dictated by others' cruelty or greed. That night, as they kept watch in shifts, Brynhildr found herself thinking about the woman she had been just months before. That person had accepted her father's assessment of her worth, had believed herself too large, too quiet, too stubborn for anyone to value. She had lived in shame and isolation, convinced that her very existence was a burden on those around her. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone who had learned her own worth through Eirik's eyes, who had discovered strength she never knew she possessed. The raiders could take their silver, burn their buildings, even threaten their lives, but they couldn't take away the transformation that had already occurred. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said to Eirik as dawn approached, "I want you to know that these months with you have been the happiest of my life. For the first time, I understand what it means to be valued for who I am, rather than dismissed for who I'm not." "The same is true for me," he replied quietly. "You've helped me become someone worth being, instead of just someone worth fearing." The torn banner they had found at the ruined farm sat between them like an accusation, evidence of betrayal so complete it seemed almost incomprehensible. But it also represented something else, the final severing of any obligation Brynhildr might have felt toward the man who had fathered her. Thorgund had made his choice, and now she would make hers. When the raiders came, and they both knew they would come, they would find not victims, but warriors, people who had something worth defending and the courage to defend it. The legend of Eirik Skullcleaver would be written one final time, but this time it would be a story of protection rather than conquest, love rather than violence. The morning mist was beginning to rise from the fjord when they saw the first riders approaching. The final battle was about to begin, and with it the test of everything they had built together in their brief season of peace. The mist clung to the fjord like a shroud as Eirik and Brynhildr made their final preparations for what they both knew would be the defining battle of their lives. The approaching riders were still distant specks against the grey morning, but their purposeful advance left no doubt about their intentions. This wasn't a scouting party or a chance encounter. This was the deliberate convergence that her father's betrayal had made inevitable. 12 riders, Eirik reported, lowering the spyglass he had been using to study their approach. Well armed, moving in formation. They know exactly where they're going and what they expect to find when they get here. Brynhildr felt her stomach clench with fear. But alongside the terror was something else. A cold, determined fury that her father's cruelty had finally awakened. She had spent her entire life accepting others' assessments of her worth, believing herself weak and worthless. But those days were over. If these raiders wanted a fight, they would discover that the woman they sought to destroy had found strength they never imagined. Eirik moved with the deadly efficiency that had earned him his fearsome reputation, but Brynhildr could see the internal struggle written in every line of his body. 3 years of peace had changed him, softened the hard edges that war had carved into his soul. The man who had once killed without hesitation now paused to consider every decision, weighing the cost of violence against the price of mercy. "I need you to understand something," he said as he checked the edge on his sword for the 3rd time. "Once this begins, I won't be the man you've come to know. The skills that will keep us alive come from a part of me that I've tried to bury, and that part doesn't always make careful distinctions about who deserves mercy." Brynhildr understood what he was trying to tell her. The legendary Skullcleaver had been forged in blood and necessity, shaped by years of conflict where survival meant embracing brutality that peaceful men couldn't imagine. But she also understood something that Eirik himself seemed to have forgotten. "You're not the same man who earned that name," she said firmly. "You have something to protect, now that's worth more than reputation or silver. That will make you stronger, not weaker." From a wooden chest that had sat undisturbed in the corner of their hall, Eirik retrieved armor that spoke of campaigns and conquests. The leather was scarred but well maintained, the metal fittings darkened with age but still functional. As he strapped on the familiar weight, Brynhildr watched his transformation with fascination and dread, but when he turned to her with a battle shield in his hands, she realized that his preparations included her in ways she hadn't expected. "This belonged to a shield maiden I once knew," he said, offering her the weapon with ceremonial gravity. "She died protecting people she loved, and I think she would approve of its use today." The shield was lighter than she had expected, but beautifully crafted. Its surface decorated with protective runes and reinforced with iron bands that caught the firelight. Fresh leather strapping showed that Eirik had repaired it specifically for this moment, preparing it as carefully as his own weapons. "I don't know how to fight," Brynhildr protested, though her hands were already testing the shield's weight and balance. "You know how to protect what matters to you," Eirik replied. "That's more important than technique. Today isn't about winning glory or proving yourself as a warrior. It's about ensuring that we survive to see tomorrow together." The next hour passed in intensive instruction as Eirik taught her the basics of shield work. How to deflect rather than absorb blows, how to use the shield's edge as a weapon, how to maintain balance while moving. His teaching was efficient and practical, focused on keeping her alive rather than making her elegant. "Don't try to be a hero," he emphasized repeatedly. "Stay behind me when possible. Watch for opportunities to help, and remember that the best victory is the one where we both walk away alive." As the riders drew closer, Astrid emerged from the kitchen, carrying supplies that spoke of long experience with siege conditions. Food that would keep, water in containers that could be moved quickly, medical supplies for treating wounds. She had lived through enough conflicts to know that battles were won as much by preparation as by courage. "I've sent word to the neighboring farms," the old woman reported. "Those who can will come to help, though I don't know how many or how quickly they can arrive." The possibility of reinforcements was encouraging, but they all knew that help might come too late to matter. The raiders had chosen their timing carefully, striking when their targets were isolated and vulnerable. Whatever help might eventually arrive, the initial fight would be theirs alone. As they positioned themselves to defend the fjordstead, Eirik's tactical mind became evident in every decision. He had chosen this location partly for its defensibility, and now those advantages became clear. The narrow approach to their valley could be defended by a small force. The buildings were positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire for archers, and escape routes led into terrain that would favor those who knew it intimately. "They'll try to divide us," he explained as they took their positions. "Standard raider tactics: create chaos, separate defenders, eliminate resistance piece by piece. Our advantage is that we know this ground, and they don't, no matter what your father might have told them." The mention of her father sent another spike of rage through Brynhildr's chest. The man who should have been their ally, who should have been leading their defense, was instead guiding their enemies toward the most vulnerable points in their defenses. The betrayal was so complete, so personally vindictive, that it still seemed impossible to believe. But as the morning wore on and the raiders' approach became unmistakable, doubt became impossible. These weren't random bandits seeking easy targets. They rode with the confidence of men who knew exactly what they would find, who had inside information about defenses and capabilities. Her father's treachery had given them every advantage except one. They expected to find victims, not fighters. It was then, in the final moments before the battle began, that Eirik took her hands and spoke words that would sustain her through everything that followed. "Whatever happens in the next few hours," he said, his pale eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the world seem to contract to just the two of them, "I want you to know that claiming you was the best decision I ever made. Not because of what you brought to my bed or my household, but because of who you helped me become." The declaration hung between them like a bridge across an abyss, carrying more weight than any formal marriage vow could have held. In that moment, Brynhildr understood that they were no longer two damaged people who had found shelter together. They were partners who had chosen each other completely, with full knowledge of the costs and consequences. "I love you," she said, the words coming easier than she had expected. Not the legendary warrior or the peaceful farmer, but the man who saw worth in me when no one else could. "And I love you," he replied. "The woman who reminded me that strength comes in many forms, and that the strongest people are often those who've learned to endure." The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their moment, but the connection they had forged would sustain them through whatever came next. They separated to their chosen positions, Eirik to the main approach where his sword would be most effective, Brynhildr to a secondary position where she could guard their flanks and retreat routes. As the first riders crested the hill overlooking their valley, Brynhildr saw her father's banner flying alongside the raiders' colors. The sight confirmed what they had already known, but made it viscerally real in a way that stolen hours of preparation could not. Jarl Thorgund rode with their enemies, his presence transforming this from a simple raid into something far more personal and bitter. But seeing him there, aligned with men who dealt in casual cruelty and meaningless destruction, Brynhildr felt the last chains of filial obligation fall away. The man below was no longer her father, in any sense that mattered. He was simply another enemy who threatened everything she had learned to value. The shield felt solid and reassuring in her grip, its weight a reminder that she was no longer the helpless victim her father had tried to create. Today, she would discover what she was truly capable of when everything she loved hung in the balance. Today, the daughter he had dismissed as worthless would show him the measure of her worth in terms he would finally understand. The raiders began their descent into the valley, and the final battle was about to begin. The raiders descended into the valley like wolves scenting blood, their horses' hooves drumming against the frozen ground with a rhythm that spoke of violence and conquest. At their head rode Jarl Thorgund, his once proud banner now flying alongside the crude standards of men who lived by theft and murder. The sight of her father, leading their enemies toward the home she had learned to love, filled Brynhildr with a cold fury that burned away the last remnants of fear. Eirik had positioned himself at the narrow entrance to their valley, where the path forced attackers to approach in single file. His sword gleamed in the morning light as he tested its balance one final time, and Brynhildr could see the transformation that had overtaken him. The peaceful farmer was gone, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous, the legendary warrior who had carved his reputation from the bones of his enemies. The first raider to reach the bottleneck was a massive man with arms like tree trunks and a beard braided with rings of stolen silver. He rode at Eirik with the confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating opponents through sheer size and ferocity. That confidence lasted exactly as long as it took for Eirik's blade to find the gap between his helmet and gorget, dropping him from his saddle like a felled oak. The casual efficiency of the kill sent a ripple of uncertainty through the remaining raiders. They had expected to face a retired warrior grown soft from years of peaceful farming, not the lethal precision that had made Eirik Skullcleaver a name whispered in fear across half of Norway. Their hesitation lasted only moments, but in battle, moments could mean the difference between victory and death. The second attacker was more cautious, circling at the edge of sword range while looking for an opening. But caution was a luxury that raiders couldn't afford when facing a man who had spent 20 years learning to read his opponent's intentions in the flicker of an eye or the shift of a shoulder. Eirik's counterattack came like lightning, his blade opening the raider's throat before the man could even attempt to defend himself. From her position guarding the flanks, Brynhildr watched the deadly dance with horrified fascination. This was the man she had come to love, but it was also a stranger, someone capable of violence that her peaceful farmer could never have imagined. Yet even in the midst of lethal combat, she could see that he took no joy in the killing, that each death was a necessity rather than a pleasure. It was then that she noticed movement on the ridge above their position. 3 raiders had broken away from the main group, using a goat path she hadn't known existed to approach from an unexpected angle. They would be behind Eirik within minutes, and he was too focused on the frontal assault to see the flanking maneuver developing. Without thinking, Brynhildr left her assigned position and ran toward the ridge path, her shield bouncing against her arm and her heart hammering with terror and determination. She had never fought anyone in her life, had never even struck another person in anger. But she would not let her father's allies murder the man who had given her everything worth living for. The lead flanker was already halfway down the slope when she intercepted him, her appearance so unexpected that he actually pulled up his horse in surprise. For a crucial moment, they stared at each other, the battle-hardened raider and the farmer's daughter he had expected to find cowering in her hall. Well, he said with a grin that revealed teeth filed to points. The famous, worthless daughter, trying to play at being a warrior. The mockery in his voice was exactly what Brynhildr needed to overcome her paralysis. 3 months ago, those words would have sent her fleeing in shame. But the woman who stood on that slope was not the same person who had been offered as a joke alongside a piece of property. She was someone who had learned her own worth, and she would not allow it to be diminished by men who measured value only in terms of what could be stolen or destroyed. When the raider spurred his horse toward her, Brynhildr did exactly what Eirik had taught her. She didn't try to stop the charge, but deflected it, using her shield to turn the horse's momentum against itself. The animal stumbled on the uneven ground, and its rider found himself suddenly fighting for balance instead of pressing an attack. The brief advantage was all Brynhildr needed. She struck with the edge of her shield, not trying for a killing blow, but simply trying to create enough chaos to disrupt the flanking attack. The iron rim caught the raider across the temple, and he toppled from his saddle with a crash that echoed across the valley. The sound of his fall reached Thorgund, who looked up from where he had been directing the main assault to see his daughter standing over a fallen enemy. For a moment, shock and something that might have been recognition flickered across his weathered features. Then a burning torch arced through the air, thrown by one of his remaining allies. It landed among the dry thatch of their storage shed, and flames began to lick hungrily at the roof. The signal fire announced that the real battle was just beginning, and that everything Brynhildr and Eirik had built together now hung in the balance of what would unfold in the next crucial minutes. The flames from the burning storage shed cast dancing shadows across the battlefield, turning the morning into something apocalyptic. Smoke billowed through the valley, stinging eyes and making it harder to distinguish friend from foe in the chaos that followed. But for Brynhildr, standing over the raider she had just felled, the world had crystallized into perfect clarity. Her hands were stained with blood now, not the first blood she had ever seen, but the first she had deliberately spilled in defense of something precious. The crimson on her fingers felt like a baptism, marking her transformation from victim to survivor in terms that could not be misunderstood. She was no longer her father's worthless daughter, but a woman who would fight for what she valued. The remaining flankers regrouped quickly, their initial surprise giving way to professional anger. These were men who had made their living through violence, and being thwarted by an untrained woman struck at their pride as much as their tactical position. They approached her more carefully now, spreading out to avoid giving her another opportunity for a lucky strike. But as they closed in, a war cry split the air that made even the hardened raiders pause in recognition. Eirik had seen the flames, had realized that the battle had expanded beyond the bottleneck he had been defending, and was coming to her aid with the fury of a man protecting everything he held dear. The legendary Skullcleaver fell upon the flankers like a force of nature, his sword weaving patterns of death that seemed almost too fast to follow. The first raider died before he could even turn to face this new threat, Eirik's blade taking him between the ribs with surgical precision. The second managed to raise his own weapon in defense, but it was like trying to stop an avalanche with a fishing net. In less than a minute, the flanking attack was broken, its survivors fleeing back up the ridge path in disorder. But the victory came at a cost. Eirik had left the main approach undefended, and Thorgund was leading the remaining raiders toward the heart of their home. "The hall?" Eirik gasped, blood streaming from a cut along his scalp where a lucky blow had found its mark. "We have to protect Astrid." They ran together through the smoke and chaos, Brynhildr's shield still clutched in her bloodied hands. Behind them, more of their outbuildings were catching fire, the work of raiders who took pleasure in destruction for its own sake. But ahead of them, the main hall still stood intact, its thick walls and defensible position representing their last hope of sanctuary. They reached the building just as Thorgund himself was dismounting at its entrance, his sword already drawn and his eyes blazing with the vindictive fury that had driven him to this betrayal. When he saw his daughter approaching with shield and blood-stained hands, his expression shifted through surprise, recognition, and finally something that might have been respect. "So," he said, his voice carrying across the yard despite the sounds of battle around them, "the worthless cow has found some fight in her after all." "I found something worth fighting for," Brynhildr replied, her voice steady despite the terror and adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Something you never gave me." Thorgund's laugh was bitter as old wine. "Worth? You speak to me of worth? I gave you life, fed you, sheltered you for 23 years, and what did I get in return? A daughter too large for beauty, too stubborn for obedience, too proud for her station. You gave me shame," Brynhildr shot back, years of suppressed anger finally finding voice. "You gave me fear and contempt, and the belief that I was worthless. But you were wrong, father. I was never worthless. I was just waiting for someone who could see my value." The confrontation between father and daughter held the attention of everyone within earshot, even the raiders pausing in their destruction to witness this final reckoning. Eirik stood beside Brynhildr, his presence a reminder of the choice she had made and the life she had chosen to defend. This man, Thorgund gestured dismissively toward Eirik. "This hired killer who bought you like livestock? You think that represents value?" "He saw strength where you saw weakness," Brynhildr replied. "He valued my mind where you scorned my thoughts. He offered partnership where you demanded submission. Yes, father, that represents value beyond anything you ever showed me. Thorgund's face darkened with rage at her defiance, but before he could respond, the battle took another turn. From the ridge came the sound of horns, the signal they had hoped for, but almost given up expecting. The neighboring farmers were arriving, armed and angry, and ready to drive out the raiders who had been terrorizing their region. The tide of battle was shifting, and Thorgund could see it in the faces of his remaining allies. What had been planned as a quick strike against isolated targets was turning into a pitched battle against aroused defenders, and raiders preferred easier prey to heroic last stands. "This isn't over," Thorgund snarled, backing toward his horse as his men began to retreat. "Yes, it is," Brynhildr said with quiet finality. "Whatever was between us ended the moment you chose to ride with killers against your own people. You have no daughter, father. You gave up that right when you gave up protecting what should have mattered most." As Thorgund and his remaining raiders fled the valley, Brynhildr felt a weight she hadn't even realized she was carrying finally lift from her shoulders. The last chains of filial obligation had been broken in blood and fire, leaving her free to become whatever she chose to be, rather than what others demanded of her. Spring came early to the fjord that year, arriving like a gentle benediction after the harsh trials of winter. The ice that had gripped the shoreline for months began to crack and shift, creating a symphony of groans and whispers that spoke of renewal and fresh beginnings. Where snow had blanketed the valley floor, green shoots pushed through the earth with determined optimism, and the air carried the sweet scent of new growth and possibility. Brynhildr stood at the window of their rebuilt hall, watching Eirik work in the garden they had planted together. His movements were peaceful and unhurried, those of a man who had finally found the balance between his warrior's past and his craftsman's present. The sword that had served them so well during the battle now hung over their hearth, honored but unused, a reminder of strength that could be called upon when needed but was no longer the defining element of their lives. The months following the raiders' defeat had brought changes that neither of them could have anticipated. Word of the battle had spread throughout the region, carried by the farmers who had arrived just in time to witness Thorgund's retreat and his daughter's courage. The story grew in the telling, as such stories do, but its essential truth remained unchanged. A legendary warrior and a dismissed daughter had stood together against overwhelming odds and emerged victorious. More importantly, the alliance that Brynhildr had negotiated with the visiting Jarls had proved both practical and lasting. Eirik's counsel was now sought on matters ranging from trade disputes to defensive strategies, his reputation as a wise leader growing to match his fame as a warrior. The isolated fjordstead had become a gathering place for men seeking solutions rather than simply superior force, and both Eirik and Brynhildr found satisfaction in helping to build something larger than their own happiness. The reconstruction of their home had been a community effort, with neighbors arriving without invitation to help repair the damage from the battle. But this time, the buildings were constructed with defense in mind, as well as comfort, incorporating lessons learned from their confrontation with the raiders. What emerged was stronger than what had been lost, both in terms of physical structures and the bonds between the people who lived there. Astrid had supervised much of the rebuilding with the efficiency of a general commanding troops, her sharp tongue and sharper eye ensuring that every board was properly placed and every joint fitted with precision. The old woman had emerged from the battle unharmed, but not unchanged, her pride in Brynhildr's courage evident in every interaction between them. The relationship that had begun as servant and mistress had evolved into something more like mother and daughter, filling a void in both their lives that neither had fully acknowledged. Of Thorgund himself they had heard little since his retreat. Reports suggested that he had fled to distant shores, his alliance with the raiders having cost him whatever respect he had retained among the regional Jarls. The banner that had announced his betrayal now served as a reminder hanging in their hall, not of victory over an enemy, but of freedom from bonds that had never been as strong as duty or love. It was on one of these peaceful spring afternoons that Eirik set aside his gardening tools and approached the hall with something in his hands that made Brynhildr's heart leap with recognition and joy. The object was clearly wooden, carved with the same careful attention to detail that marked all his craftsmanship. But its purpose was unmistakable. "For our child," he said simply, placing the beautifully crafted cradle on the table between them. "When they arrive." The cradle was a work of art, its sides decorated with protective runes and scenes of peaceful domestic life, families gathered around hearth fires, ships returning safely to harbor, children playing in gardens where flowers bloomed eternal. Every curve and joint spoke of love and hope, of a future built not on conquest or reputation, but on the quiet satisfaction of lives well lived. Brynhildr ran her fingers along the smooth wood, feeling tears of gratitude well in her eyes. The child growing within her would know from birth that they were wanted, valued, celebrated for their very existence rather than judged by impossible standards. They would grow up in a home where strength was measured in many ways, where intelligence was valued over beauty, where kindness mattered more than conformity. "They'll know their father was a legend," she said softly, "but they'll also know he chose to be something more than his reputation. And they'll know their mother was brave enough to fight for what she loved," Eirik replied, settling beside her and placing his hand over hers where it rested on the cradle's edge. "That she refused to accept others' definitions of her worth and chose to define herself instead." The afternoon sun slanted through their windows, illuminating the simple furnishings that had replaced the faded grandeur of her father's longhouse. There were no rich tapestries here, no displays of wealth or power, but there was something far more valuable: peace, built on the foundation of mutual respect and genuine affection. As evening approached, they sat together by the fire that had witnessed so many quiet conversations during their courtship. The flames danced in the hearth, casting familiar shadows on walls that had sheltered their love through its tentative beginnings and its triumphant flowering. Outside, the fjord lapped gently against the shore, its rhythm as constant and reassuring as a heartbeat. "Do you ever regret it?" Brynhildr asked, though she knew the answer from the contentment in his eyes. Giving up the wandering life, the freedom of the sword, the reputation that opened every door. Eirik considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, then smiled with the warmth that had first made her believe she might be worthy of love. "I gave up nothing that mattered," he said firmly. "I found everything that did." The cradle sat between them like a promise of tomorrows yet to be written, its smooth wood glowing in the firelight. Whatever challenges the future might hold, they would face them as they had faced everything else, together, with the strength that came from being truly seen and genuinely valued by another soul. In the distance, a ship's horn sounded across the water, carrying news from distant shores and reminding them that the world beyond their valley continued its ancient patterns of conflict and change. But here, in their sanctuary of peace, love had proven stronger than cruelty, hope more enduring than despair, and the simple act of choosing each other had transformed two wounded souls into something greater than either could have been alone. The fire settled into glowing embers, and they prepared for sleep in the home they had built together, not just with wood and stone, but with patience, understanding, and the revolutionary belief that everyone deserves to be loved for exactly who they are.